8 months pregnant, Sarah Langley set out for the hospital, waving goodbye to her husband and young son, and was never seen again. For 12 years, her family clung to hope while investigators chased dead-end leads. Then, miles from her route, a routine property survey uncovered something buried deep in the soil, a find that would drag the case into the unforgiving light of the truth. It was just after sunset when Sarah backed her silver Toyota Corolla out of the driveway. The November air was cold enough to turn her breath into small clouds, and the frost on the grass hinted at the winter ahead. Inside the car, her hospital bag was buckled into the passenger seat alongside a folded blanket and a small cooler with snacks, a simple preparation for what should have been a routine drive to the county medical center. Her husband, Mark, stood on the porch holding their 4-year-old son, watching the taillights disappear down the quiet road. He planned to follow shortly after arranging childcare with his sister, but Sarah insisted she'd be fine. She knew the route well, a 30-minute stretch along the state highway, then another 10 minutes along a rural road that wound into town. Neighbors later said she appeared calm when she passed their homes. One remembered the soft glow of her headlights against the darkening fields. Another recalled seeing her pause at a stop sign, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting on the curve of her stomach. Nothing about her demeanor suggested distress or urgency beyond the normal pace of early labor. By 7:15 p.m., Mark called her, expecting she might already be in triage. The call went to voicemail. He tried again minutes later with the same result. At first, he assumed her phone was switched off as part of the hospital check-in process. But when he called the hospital directly, they confirmed she hadn't arrived. That's when the unease began to take hold. By 8 p.m., the worry had turned into action. Deputies from the county sheriff's office began patrolling the highway and rural backroads, scanning the shoulders for fresh tire tracks, skid marks, or debris. They looked for any sign of an accident, a broken guardrail, a damaged fence line, even a scrape in the pavement that might suggest a vehicle had left the road. They found nothing. Searchers expanded their sweep to nearby pull-off areas and creek crossings, but each check came back empty. No car, no belongings, no Sarah. It was as if she and the unborn child had vanished in a gap between one town and the next. Mark's calls continued to go unanswered. As the hours passed, the space between hope and dread grew smaller. What began as a routine drive had already turned into something else, something no one on that quiet November night could explain. The search for Sarah began before the sun came up the next morning. Deputies gathered at the sheriff's office alongside volunteer firefighters, local hunters, and residents who knew the back roads better than any map. They broke into small teams, each assigned a section of highway, rural road, or open field. Search dogs were brought in, handlers working them along the ditches and fence lines. The dogs caught Sarah's scent from an item of her clothing, but on the highway, the trail faded quickly, lost in the mix of other vehicle exhaust and cold night air. A helicopter was called in to scan from above, its spotlight sweeping over farm fields and wooded areas, but no signs of a crash or abandoned vehicle appeared. Investigators checked every business along her route for security footage. One camera at a highway rest stop captured a silver sedan pulling in around 6:18 p.m. The timestamp fit her travel window, and the shape of the driver matched her build. But the footage was grainy, and within seconds, she disappeared from the frame. Deputies canvassed the area, but the clerk on duty didn't recall seeing a pregnant woman come inside that night. Over the next several days, the search widened. Teams walked creek beds, drainage ditches, and the edges of forest lines. Old barns, hunting shacks, and abandoned farmhouses were checked, some for the first time in years. The effort was thorough, but every location came back clear. Tips from the public started to trickle in. A trucker claimed he saw a car like Sarah's pulled over on the interstate shoulder hours after she vanished, but his description didn't match her license plate. Another caller insisted they saw her in a diner 2 counties over, but the woman turned out to be someone else. Each lead ended in disappointment. As the first week ended, the tone shifted from rescue to recovery. Deputies still followed up on calls, but the large-scale ground searches slowed. By the end of the second week, the sheriff's office officially labeled the investigation as inactive, pending new information. For Mark and Sarah's sister Ellen, those words felt like giving up. They continued driving the same stretches of road, studying the tree lines, watching for anything that looked out of place. They were looking for proof, any proof, that she had been there. But day after day, the road stayed empty. Sarah Langley had left her driveway just before dark. By the time night fully settled, she was gone, and no one could explain where or how. In a town the size of Meadow Ridge, a disappearance doesn't fade quietly. For months after Sarah vanished, her face was everywhere, taped to grocery store doors, tacked on bulletin boards at the post office, and posted in the windows of local diners. Anyone who'd ever known her, even in passing, felt the absence. At the Langley home, the front door rarely stayed shut for long. Friends and neighbors came by with meals, coffee, or just to sit in silence with Mark and Ellen. Church members formed prayer circles in the living room. Some visits brought comfort, but others carried questions that cut too close, whispered theories about what might have happened, asked as if the answers could be found in Mark's expression. Mark kept his responses short. He didn't want to guess, and he didn't want to hear other people's guesses. He spent his days caring for his son, avoiding places where the wrong kind of sympathy might find him. In private, though, the weight of uncertainty pressed in. Nights were the hardest, staring at the empty space in bed, wondering if Sarah was out there somewhere, cold, scared, and waiting for help that never came. Ellen refused to let the case fade. She printed new flyers every week, replacing the ones that had been torn or weathered by the wind. She kept an online page updated with timelines, photos, and pleas for information. Whenever the sheriff's office released even the smallest update, she pushed it out to the community. She reminded everyone of the details that mattered, that Sarah had been excited for the baby, that the nursery was ready, and that the hospital bag had been in her car. There was no sign she wanted to leave, and nothing in her life suggested she would vanish voluntarily. Deputy Mike Collins was one of the few in law enforcement who stayed personally invested. He'd been on shift the night she disappeared and remembered the frustration of those first hours when every lead went cold. Over the years, he kept Sarah's file within arm's reach, reviewing it when new cases slowed, hoping that time or a fresh perspective might uncover something missed. But outside that small circle, life in Meadow Ridge moved on. The flyers came down. The news stopped covering the story. And eventually, Sarah's name was spoken less often in public, except by those who had never stopped searching for her. Almost a year after Sarah disappeared, Deputy Mike Collins received a tip that stood out from the usual calls. It came from an older man who had lived along County Road 14 his entire life, a narrow two-lane stretch that linked the state highway to a scattering of farms, hunting cabins, and long abandoned logging sites. The man explained that on the night Sarah vanished, he had stepped outside around 6:30 p.m. for a cigarette. The air had been sharp with cold, the kind that made the frost crunch underfoot. Through a break in the bare winter trees, he could see a short section of the road. That's when he noticed a silver sedan pulled over onto the shoulder. Parked directly behind it was a dark pickup truck, its engine running, headlights casting a steady beam across the frost-coated grass. From his porch, the man couldn't make out faces. The vehicles were roughly 200 yards away, and the failing light made details difficult to see. He saw no movement outside either vehicle, no one standing between them, no doors swinging open or shut. The sedan's brake lights glowed faintly, a sign the engine might still be running. The truck stayed in place for several minutes while the man lingered outside, smoke curling from his cigarette. Eventually, he went back inside, thinking little of it at the time. When Collins pressed him for specifics, the man admitted he couldn't give a license plate number. He wasn't certain of the sedan's make or model, only that it was small, silver, and close in size to a Toyota Corolla. He didn't recognize the pickup either, though he guessed it might have been an older model, judging by the rectangular shape of the headlights. What stayed with him wasn't the details of the vehicles themselves, but how wrong the scene had looked. That road rarely saw traffic after dark. When someone did pull over, it was usually for a deer crossing or a quick stop to make a phone call. A truck idling directly behind another vehicle and staying there felt deliberate. Deputies canvassed the area in the week following the tip. They knocked on doors, checked driveways, and asked every nearby resident if they had seen the vehicles. No one else had. Security footage from the closest gas station and 2 farm entrances didn't reach that stretch of road. Without physical evidence, the lead stalled. For many on the investigative team, it was filed away as another dead end. But Collins saw it differently. If the sedan was Sarah's, then someone had stopped behind her that night, someone who wasn't offering roadside help. At the time, no one knew it would take over a decade for that same stretch of road to resurface. In this case, the answers were unexpected. 12 years passed before Sarah Langley's name returned to the top of Deputy Mike Collins' desk. In that time, Meadow Ridge had seen new developments, new families, and new faces in the sheriff's office. But for Collins, her file never collected dust. It sat within arm's reach, waiting for something, anything, that might bring it back to life. That moment came in late spring, when a call came from a neighboring county's sheriff. A logging crew had been clearing an overgrown property about 20 miles from Sarah's last known route. As they worked near the tree line, one of the operators noticed a strip of faded silver metal half buried in the soil. At first, they thought it was scrap left from old farm equipment. But when the crew dug deeper, they uncovered the front end of a car. Deputies arrived within the hour. The vehicle, once pulled from the earth, was identified as a silver Toyota Corolla, the same make and model Sarah had been driving the night she vanished. The car's license plates had been removed, and years of dirt and rust had eaten away much of the body. Still, the vehicle identification number on the frame matched Sarah's. The location was remote, a private parcel of land surrounded by thick woods and accessible only by a narrow dirt path. According to county records, the property had changed hands multiple times over the years, most recently inherited by a man who lived out of state. There were no houses nearby, so there was no reason for casual visitors to stumble across it. Inside the car, the passenger seat still held the remains of a canvas hospital bag, its zipper rusted shut. A small, brittle baby blanket lay folded inside, along with a faded paperback novel and a bottle of water long gone dry. The driver's seat told a different story. The seat belt was cut clean through, and the steering wheel showed damage consistent with a heavy impact. Collins stood at the site for a long time, staring at the Corolla. The site brought back every unanswered question from the first days of the case. But now there was something tangible. Proof that Sarah's journey had ended here, not on the hospital road she was supposed to take. The discovery shifted the case overnight. The sheriff's office announced a formal reopening of the investigation, and forensic teams began combing through the area. For the first time in over a decade, there was momentum. And for the first time, Collins felt that the truth, buried for 12 years, might finally be within reach. The discovery of Sarah's car didn't just restart the investigation, it lit a fire under it. Within days, the sheriff's office assembled a task force, combining deputies from Meadow Ridge with detectives from the state police. The media picked up the story, running headlines about a 12-year mystery reignited, and the Langley family was once again thrust into the public eye. Forensic teams moved carefully through the wooded lot where the Corolla had been buried. They sifted through soil, looking for fibers, fragments, or anything that might have survived over the years. Every inch of the car was documented before it was towed to a secure facility for processing. The first report was frustrating. Most trace evidence had been destroyed by time, weather, and soil pressure. Still, they found small victories. The cut seatbelt, damage to the steering wheel, and a faint reddish stain beneath the driver's side floor mat that would be sent for testing. Collins pushed to re-interview everyone connected to the case. Old witnesses were tracked down, some now living in other states. Many remembered little beyond what they'd already said, but there were subtle differences in how some retold their accounts. One neighbor admitted they hadn't mentioned seeing an unfamiliar truck near the Langley home the day before Sarah vanished. Back then, they hadn't connected it to the case. Detectives also revisited the tip from the man on County Road 14, the sighting of the silver sedan and the dark pickup truck idling behind it. The location of that sighting and the property where the car was found were only a few miles apart. When mapped, the 2 points fell along a route that avoided the main road to the hospital. Public tips began flooding in again. Most were dead ends, but one stood out. A former farmhand who had worked on a property near the burial site claimed to remember a man bringing in loads of gravel. Late at night during the winter, Sarah disappeared. He couldn't remember the exact date, but the detail matched the idea of someone concealing a vehicle. The task force also dug into property records, focusing on owners and tenants with criminal histories. One name quickly rose to the top, a man with prior assault charges who had briefly lived on the land before moving away in 2013. His last known address was out of state, but his name had surfaced before in unrelated missing person investigations. For Collins, each new lead tightened the circle. After 12 years, they finally had a path forward. The challenge was moving fast enough to keep momentum and careful enough not to lose the fragile thread they'd found. 2 weeks after Sarah's car was recovered, the forensic lab called Collins with a result that shifted the case into overdrive. The faint reddish stain under the driver's side floor mat wasn't dirt or rust. It was human blood. Even more telling, the DNA matched Sarah's. The finding confirmed what investigators had suspected but couldn't prove. Sarah had been injured, maybe fatally, before the Corolla was buried. But the report also revealed something else, a secondary DNA profile. It was only a partial match, degraded from years in the ground, but enough to show it belonged to a man. The profile didn't immediately match anyone in state or federal databases, but it narrowed the scope. Meanwhile, detectives tracked down the man who had once lived on the property where the car was found, a drifter named Russell Kane. In 2011, Kane had been working odd jobs for cash, moving from one rural rental to another. His criminal history included 2 arrests for assault and a restraining order filed by a former girlfriend. Kane had left Meadow Ridge in early 2013 and hadn't been back. When contacted by phone, Kane denied ever seeing Sarah or her car. He claimed the property had been just woods during his time there and said he had no idea a vehicle was buried on the land. But his tone changed when detectives pressed about his movements in November 2011. His answers grew vague, and he ended the call by saying, "You're digging in the wrong place." Collins also noticed a troubling overlap. Kane's known hangouts in 2011 included a bar less than 2 miles from the stretch of County Road 14, where the sedan and pickup had been spotted. Several locals remembered seeing him drive an older, dark-colored truck during that time, the same type described in the original tip. The task force began piecing together a rough timeline. Kane was known to work night shifts for a small trucking outfit during the week. On the night Sarah vanished, there was no confirmed record of him clocking in. Cell tower data from his old phone showed pings along the corridor between Meadow Ridge and the property where the car was found. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to deepen suspicion. For Collins, this was the moment where the case stopped being a cold trail and became something tangible. They had a suspect with opportunity, a potential vehicle match, and physical evidence pointing toward foul play. The challenge now was tying it all together before Kane could disappear again, and making sure whatever happened to Sarah and her unborn child didn't vanish into silence a second time. With the evidence mounting, the task force decided it was time to bring Russell Kane in for questioning. They coordinated with authorities in the state where he now lived, arranging for local deputies to pick him up on a warrant for failure to appear in an unrelated assault case. It was enough to get him in a room without tipping their whole hand. Collins and 2 state detectives made the trip, sitting across from Kane in a small, windowless interview room. He looked older than his file photo, thinner with deep lines etched into his face, but his eyes remained sharp and watchful. At first, the questions were broad: where he'd been living, what jobs he'd held, whether he remembered the Meadow Ridge property. Kane stuck to short answers, claiming he barely recalled the place and denying any connection to Sarah Langley. When Collins slid a photo of the recovered Corolla across the table, Kane leaned back in his chair. He glanced at it briefly before looking away, offering only that it wasn't his and that he had no idea how it ended up buried in the woods. Then Collins mentioned the partial DNA profile found in the car. Kane's demeanor shifted. He stopped making eye contact, his responses growing slower and more guarded. When pressed about the night of Sarah's disappearance, he gave an inconsistent timeline, first saying he'd been home, then claiming he'd been on a delivery run. The break came when detectives showed him a map marking County Road 14, the witness sighting of a silver sedan and dark pickup, and the property where the car had been found. Kane studied it for several seconds, his expression tightening, before remarking that people often misinterpret what they think they've seen. He never confessed, but his evasions and contradictions spoke loudly enough. By the end of the interview, the task force had enough to label him the prime suspect. The following steps would be building a case strong enough for charges, and that meant finding direct evidence linking Kane to Sarah in her final hours. For Collins, walking out of that room didn't feel like victory. It felt like a door creaking open, one that could either lead to long-awaited answers or slam shut again if they couldn't act fast enough. The turning point came 3 months after Kane's interview. The forensic lab finally returned results on soil samples taken from beneath the Corolla. Buried deep in the compacted earth were small, deteriorated fragments of fabric. Under microscopic analysis, they were identified as a cotton-polyester blend, common in maternity clothing from the early 2000s. On 2 of the fragments, technicians detected trace amounts of dried blood. DNA testing confirmed what investigators feared. It belonged to Sarah Langley. The discovery shifted the case entirely. It suggested Sarah had been injured outside the vehicle before it was buried, ruling out the possibility of an accident. It also hinted at restraint or forced movement, pointing toward an intentional crime rather than a tragic mishap. While the lab worked, Collins revisited a witness statement from the original investigation, the sighting of a dark pickup truck traveling close behind a silver sedan on County Road 14. At the time, the lead had gone nowhere, but a recent tip from a retired mechanic changed that. He remembered servicing a black pickup in late 2011 for a man who insisted on replacing the bedliner and having the entire truck bed scrubbed clean. The mechanic recalled the customer paying in cash and declining a receipt. Collins pulled old vehicle registration records and quickly found a match. A black 1998 Ford F-150 registered to Russell Kane during that exact period. Further digging revealed the truck had been sold out of state in early 2012, just months after Sarah vanished. Investigators tracked the vehicle to its current location, a rusting hulk sitting in the back of a salvage yard 2 states away. The bedliner was gone, but when crime scene technicians applied luminol, faint traces of blood glowed in the seams where the metal panels met. Though the samples were degraded, one produced a partial DNA match to Sarah. The evidence was mounting. Sarah's blood on fabric buried with her car, traces of her DNA in Kane's former truck, and a direct link between the witness sighting and Kane's vehicle. It was no longer circumstantial. It was a chain of connections pointing straight to him. Collins knew they were close, but he also knew how fragile a case could be without a confession or a witness willing to testify. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and agreed it was strong enough to move forward. A warrant was drafted for Kane's arrest on suspicion of murder, kidnapping, and unlawful burial. For Collins, it marked the first real step toward justice in over a decade. The long, stagnant trail had finally given way to tangible proof that someone had taken Sarah from that cold November night and buried not just her car, but the truth itself. Now, after 12 years, the truth was starting to claw its way back into the light. Russell Kane was arrested at dawn without incident. Detectives transported him to Meadow Ridge, where he was booked and placed in an interrogation room. The walls were bare, the lighting harsh, and the air heavy with the weight of 12 years of unanswered questions. At first, Kane refused to speak, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. Hours passed. Detectives laid out the evidence piece by piece: the recovered Corolla, The partial DNA in the vehicle, the fibers from Sarah's clothing, and the blood traces found in the bed of his old truck. They spoke in calm, measured tones, explaining how each piece fit together. Kane sat in silence, his expression betraying nothing. It was when Collins slid the photo of the deteriorated fabric across the table that Kane's composure faltered. His eyes lingered on the image longer than any other. The lead detective didn't rush him. Instead, he let the silence work, filling the room with a tension that couldn't be ignored. Kane began speaking in fragments, at first claiming the encounter with Sarah had been a chance meeting on the rural road. He said she had pulled over, complaining of labor pains, and that he had offered to help. But his version quickly unraveled. Details shifted. Timelines contradicted themselves. He admitted she had gotten into his truck, but insisted it was just to rest. As the questioning continued, the story darkened. Kane eventually described driving Sarah to the old farmhouse where he was staying. He claimed he intended to take her to the hospital, but panicked when she became unresponsive. He said she had fallen, struck her head, and died before help could be reached. Detectives noted how he avoided explaining the blood in his truck and why her car had been deliberately buried. When pressed about the unborn child, Kane's tone grew colder. He admitted he knew someone, his sister, who had wanted a baby but couldn't have one. According to Kane, the child was born alive and taken from the farmhouse that same night. His sister, living in another state, raised the girl as her own, with no acknowledgement of where she had truly come from. Kane described burying Sarah in a shallow grave behind the tree line near the property. He offered no remorse, speaking as if recounting the disposal of an object rather than a person. By the time the confession ended, it was clear to detectives that much of Kane's account was still self-serving, possibly omitting key details. But in his own words, he had placed himself with Sarah in her final hours, explained how her car came to be hidden, and revealed what had happened to the child. For Collins, it was a hollow kind of victory. The truth had been spoken aloud, but it was stripped of compassion. Still, after 12 years, the family would finally know what happened, even if the answers were far from comforting. In the months that followed Kane's arrest, prosecutors prepared for trial. The charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful burial carried the possibility of life in prison. Kane's sister was located in another state, where the girl, now 12 years old, had been living. She was removed from the home and placed in protective custody, while authorities determined her future. For Sarah's family, the discovery of the child brought conflicting emotions. There was relief in knowing she had survived, but grief in realizing she had grown up without her mother, unaware of who she truly was. The girl's resemblance to Sarah was unmistakable, the same deep-set eyes, the same way her smile tilted to one side. Meeting her was like catching a fleeting glimpse of the life Sarah never got to live. The property where the Corolla had been buried was searched again. This time, investigators uncovered the shallow grave Kane had described. Sarah's remains were recovered, along with a simple silver bracelet her sister remembered giving her at her baby shower. The bracelet was tarnished, but still intact, a small, stubborn piece of the past refusing to disappear. When news of Kane's arrest broke, Meadow Ridge reacted with a mix of shock and grim vindication. For years, rumors had circulated about the drifter who kept to himself, who left town so suddenly after Sarah vanished. Now the whispers were replaced by quiet acknowledgement that those suspicions had been justified. Sarah was laid to rest in a small cemetery on the edge of town, the same place where her parents were buried. The service was simple, attended by family, close friends, and a few neighbors who had never forgotten her face on the missing posters. Her son, now a teenager, stood beside the casket, clutching a folded program in one hand. For Detective Collins, the case closed with no sense of triumph, only the knowledge that persistence had finally pulled the truth into the light. The investigation had taken 12 years, but Sarah's name would no longer sit in the cold case files.